Disabilities Professor Dr. Freda Briggs has generously offered her skills and expertise to share with us today. The warning signs and depth of the problems and ways that we can protect ourselves and our loved ones to prevent, detect and report where necessary these terrible happenings. Dr. Briggs left England some 35 years ago. She became interested in the area of child protection, first as a policewoman in London, then as a residential social worker, and finally as a teacher in disadvantaged schools. After becoming a lecturer in sociology and education, her established interest in child protection and abuse led to the introduction of a course, Child Protection, a community concern in 1980. In 1980, Freda was appointed Foundation Dean of the Delisa Institute of Early Institute and Family Studies, and then as Associate Professor of Childhood Development at the University of South Australia in 1991, Professor in 1994, which is a position she still holds. Freda became one of the first Australian academics to engage in non-medical research relating to child protection, and to date she's written 13 books and scores of articles.
16 now.
Oh. Sorry. If you could just erase that bit out of the video, that'd be much better. 16 books and scores of research relating to different aspects of the problem. Through her roles as an educator, author, scholar, and ambassador, she's worked tirelessly and passionately to work toward her vision to provide a safer and more caring world for children. So please join me in welcoming very, very thankfully Dr. Freda Briggs.
Thank you. I've listed there what I think you need to know, and it's a lot to cover between now and 12:30, but I'll do my best. I will be referring to children most of the time because saying children, young people and adults is just too much. And when I'm talking about sex offenders, I'm sorry guys, but I won't be saying men and women. I'll probably be talking about he rather than she. Not because there are no women offenders, but the fact is we know so little about them because there aren't many in jail. My research with sex offenders obviously had to be in jails, and I mean they're sitting ducks in there, whereas if you haven't got many women in jail you can't do research that's really constructive, so that accounts for it. Not that I want to be offensive to anybody. So looking at the big picture, the Australian government uses the statistic that 1 in 3 girls and slightly fewer boys experience some form of sexual abuse before they are 18. Now, shocking as this is, I want to emphasise that government figures rely entirely on reports, and our research shows that offences against boys and children with disabilities are very rarely reported. In other words, the situation is far, far worse than those figures suggest. Boys are abused at a younger age and by many more people than girls. Girls are most likely to be abused in the home, boys outside it, both individually and in groups. Boys are also forced to abuse each other for the entertainment of pedophiles, creating the next generation of offenders, especially boys who get trapped into pedophile groups. 198 Australian men told us that they were sexually abused by 1,700 different people before the age of 16. That's an average of 8.5 different offenders for each child. Only 26 boys tried to make a report, and only 1 succeeded. The rest were all disbelieved and often punished for making up bad lies about these lovely people that parents and teachers trusted. No action was taken, meaning that 1,700 sex offenders got away with their crimes, and given that sex offending is habitual, like smoking or anything else, it's likely that they went on to abuse hundreds, if not thousands more. Now, if 1 in 3 children had green hair, we would say that green hair is normal. But we can't accept sex abuse as normal because of the horrendous damage that it causes, both to victims and to families, to society and even the economy. And to families in particular, when it's somebody in the family that is the abuser. When mum reports it and it's dad's family is likely to attack her, and you get huge family disruption. Child abuse is costing the taxpayer billions of dollars every year. It's been assessed. It's in the billions. Think about it. We're paying for social workers, police, family and criminal courts, prisons, counsellors, hospital staff, doctors and psychologists. Melbourne psychiatrist Bill Glazer says that sex abuse victims are 7 times more likely than others to experience long-lasting psychiatric illness, more likely to abuse drugs, more likely to abuse alcohol to hide their pain, and more likely to suicide. Male victims become aggro and many engage in antisocial behaviour such as arson when they reach adolescence. We found that many get confused about their sexuality and in adolescence will try out to see if they are gay. They put themselves back in the victim role and are then more psychologically disturbed than ever. Glazer made a relevant comment. He said, if there was an illness that had such terrible lifelong consequences, the government would take immediate action. Look how quickly they responded to horse flu, swine flu, and AIDS in particular. The federal government, Jenny Macklin, even omitted child sex abuse in the first draft of the National Child Protection Framework. You can imagine I was jumping up and down and actually went to Canberra to talk about this. And even when the final copy came out, there's only 1.5 pages dedicated to child protection. It doesn't say anything about the need for national legislation, national standards, the need for a national child protection programme in schools, the need to have a better justice system, which we obviously need for child sex abuse cases. None of that. And when did you ever see an advertisement telling people to stop sexually abusing kids? We've had domestic violence advertisements that cost the federal government millions, but they were aimed to stop the abuse of women. When did you see one urging offenders to seek help? I'd love one on the back of buses around Adelaide so that when you're stuck behind it in a traffic jam, it's there in your face. Have you ever seen an advertisement showing where you can go for help if children have been abused? Given the cost of child abuse, why is this ignored? Now, today's session was organised by a politician, and in half a century of working in this field, this is the very first time that a politician has been proactive in this regard. Whether or not you find today useful, thank you to Kelly and her staff who worked very hard to get this together. Now, if you thought that 1 in 3 girls is a bad statistic, a vast survey of women by Griffith University recently showed that almost half had experienced some form of unwanted sex before they left school. In other words, you're damned lucky if you haven't been sexually abused. And if that isn't bad enough, the risk to disabled children is 800% greater than for non-disabled children. Now, I know that some of you have been questioning that figure, but it's come directly from the New South Wales State Government in a training package for doctors. It's in Dick Sops's work, and he is the expert on violence against children and adults with disabilities, and also a guy called Sen, who collected all the data. Margaret Kennedy, who is coming to Australia to a conference. She's a UK deaf victim of a Catholic priest. She created an organisation called Keep Deaf Children Safe and published a child protection booklet in sign language. Now, when we wrote the big blue book that's expensive, we were hoping to put sign language in there and then found that we couldn't because it varies from state to state. She found that 56% of deaf boys had been sexually abused both at home and at school, and that some offenders who are really devious, manipulative, incredibly so, always one jump ahead, had learned sign language specifically to gain access to these kids. And these were not professionals who were working with them. My experience of disability comes from two sources. Until 3 weeks ago, I had been my brain-injured husband's carer for many, many years, and he's just gone into full-time residential care. And he always said that he'd never been abused, typical man. And then when I was doing some research and preparing the questions, one question that I started out with, how old were you when you had your first sexual experience? Well, it's okay for guys to have sexual experiences, but it's not okay for them to be abused. You know, he'd been telling me for years and years and years he'd never been abused. And he said, oh, let me think. I was about 7. And how old was the other person? Oh, she was his older brother's girlfriend. She was about 21. I kept a deadpan face and said, well, how old were you when you had your second? Oh, he was about 8, and he went to a cinema, to a cowboy film or something, and a big Afro-American serviceman came into this movie and sat next door to him, and guess what? And we also got onto a third one because he used to go into the library to do it. It came from a big family and not much space. He'd go into the reference library to do his homework, and that seems to have been full of dirty old men as well. The reason that he thought he hadn't been abused was he got away. On each occasion, he got away. And we find that if boys get away, they discount it because they think they were in control, they were in power, and of course they weren't. And even though he got away, it affected his life. He stopped going to the library, he never went to the cinema again until he met me, and we found a cinema with double seats on the back row, you know, when you got nowhere else to do your kissing and your cuddling. And it still had an effect, even though it was pretty low as child abuse goes, you know. When we were doing research with children with learning disabilities, I actually did research initially, able to compare them with kids who hadn't been disabled, and then went on just to look at the safety issues for children who've been disabled. And a lot of my work's been done with New Zealand Police, but also in 2001, I interviewed over 700 children in Australia, predominantly in South Australia. When I interviewed 11 to 14-year-olds, those with learning disabilities revealed that they were the ones most vulnerable to all risks. They were recruited to commit crimes such as shoplifting, you do it, and I get the benefit, I'll wait outside. They suffered physical abuse, they suffered exposure to pornography. That was a really common one, because pornography is used to desensitize kids before they're going to be sexually abused. And of course they suffered psychological and sexual abuse as well. Both boys and girls said they carried knives, supposedly to protect themselves, but what concerned me was that some boys who were only 12 told us they had 30-year-old girlfriends, and this was known to their mothers and to their caseworkers. And although the relationships were entirely sexual and clearly constituted child abuse, they were tolerated. And what this told me was that social workers permitted different standards of behaviour for young people with disabilities. The most vulnerable to rape were girls living with intellectually disabled parents or in dysfunctional families. Some were raped by